Collective Insights is a voyage through topics and technologies revolutionizing human well-being. Groundbreaking approaches for a better world and a better life await you. Welcome to Collective Insights. Collective Insights and the work we do at Neurohacker Collective is made possible from the support of our community and the sales of our product, Qualia. Qualia is a comprehensive mental enhancement supplement designed to improve focus, mood, and flow state. Learn more about Qualia at neurohacker.com and use coupon code CollectiveInsights20 for $20 off your first order.
Welcome to Collective Insights. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Sandison. I'm a naturopathic doctor and the medical director of North County Natural Medicine, and I also serve here at Neurohacker Collective on the medical advisory board. So today I am really honored to have both a friend and colleague, Dr. Jamie Corroon, joining us. Dr. Corroon has a naturopathic doctorate and as well as a master's in public health from San Diego State University. He's the founder and medical director of the Center for Medical Cannabis Education. And Dr. Corroon is a licensed naturopathic doctor, peer-reviewed clinical researcher, and industry consultant with a focus on medical cannabis. He's committed to investigating the important clinical and public health questions resulting from the broadening acceptance of cannabis in society. Welcome, Dr. Corroon. It's nice to have you today.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here.
So I thought we would start with what are we calling this these days? So, in high school we called it weed. Today we talk about CBD and THC ratios, cannabinoids. What is it that you are studying? When we say cannabis, what does that mean?
Yeah, this plant has so many names, more names than any other plant, and all of them are really fun and funny to say. But in the scientific literature, we stick to the botanical name, which is Cannabis sativa. Cannabis is the genus, and sativa is the species. And it does get more complicated because we talk about common names with regard to plants, and it's not the common name is because hemp could be considered a common name, and perhaps marijuana could be considered a common, but even hemp and marijuana are two different things, even though they're the same plant by virtue of the genus and the species, and we can tease that out a little bit more. The term marijuana has this pejorative historical use in that it was, I think, used early in the 19th century to refer to Mexican immigrants who had come over into the U.S. and seemed to pose a threat to the establishment at the time. And there's a pretty long sordid history of using that word to demonize this group of people. And so there's a lot of people, myself included, who would prefer not to use the term. At the same time, it does seem to serve a role in terms of clarifying the difference between hemp and marijuana. And then there's all of the other fun and funky names that people use to describe what they're going to do in the parking lot before the concert or whatever. But maybe I should talk a little bit about the difference between hemp and marijuana.
Yeah, please do, because you just educated me right now. I didn't realize that cannabis sativa referred to both hemp and marijuana. I would have thought that there was a different species, and that maybe they shared the genus. So I would love for you to expand on what are the differences. How would we know? And clearly at a regulatory level, there's a difference. But please.
Yeah, my understanding is that the first time that marijuana was defined, at least from a regulatory standpoint, was in 1937 with the Marihuana Tax Act, which was an attempt to basically levy taxes against the purchase and the sale of marijuana such that it would make it more difficult for people to access. And that definition was adopted in 1970 when Richard Nixon was the president for the definition of marijuana in the Controlled Substances Act. And that was passed, as I said, in 1970. And the definition of marijuana there was, and it's rather extensive, but it's basically the cannabis sativa plant every compound or constituent in the plant, the flowering tops, etc., except for the mature stalks and the sterilized seeds, and then compounds that would come from the mature stalks and the sterilized seeds. And so that's really the definition from a regulatory standpoint that we have right now from marijuana, and it comes from the Controlled Substances Act. The Controlled Substances Act does not define hemp. It defines marijuana and not marijuana. But the DEA in public statements has come to basically associate what is defined as not marijuana in the Controlled Substances Act as hemp, and has a very significant historical use in our culture, also going back to the 1800s, where it was grown by virtually everybody to be used in styles, clothing, rope, things of that nature, and it was mostly using the fiber from the stalk. And so hemp plants from a physical appearance or a phenotypic standpoint tend to be really tall with very long stalks and not a lot of flowers, whereas marijuana plants tend to be short and fat with big fat flowers that concentrate the resin. But as far as the definition is concerned, that was the definition of marijuana, and by exclusion hemp, until the Farm Bill or the Farm Act was passed in 2014, in which case hemp was actually defined as the cannabis sativa plant with a concentration of THC, the principal psychoactive cannabinoid, of less than 0.3% by dry weight. And so I realize this might be getting a little bit confusing, but if you had two plants sitting on a table in front of you, and they were both of the genus Cannabis and the species Sativa, and then you plucked off a flower or a bud from each of these plants, and you dried them, and then you sent them to a lab, if one of them, by dry weight, had less than 0.3% THC, we would call that one hemp. And if the other one had 0.3% or greater, we would call that one marijuana.
That is fascinating. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but like I'm drawing a parallel with tropical flowers. So say you have a hibiscus and you have all these hibiscus and one is yellow and one is red. Is that kind of the degree of difference that we're talking about? It's just a phenotypic difference. So it's a genetic expression that shows up differently, but the genetic potential is in the hemp to express the THC.
Definitely genes play a huge role in it. THC is synthesized as THCA. And THC, when we say THC, typically we're referring to delta-9 THC. And THCA is the acid form of it, which is the form that is naturally occurring in a plant. And that form is not psychoactive. When the acid is removed through decarboxylation, which is what happens when light or heat is exposed to THCA, the carboxylic acid comes off and it becomes psychoactive. And so there's a gene, THC synthase, or there's an enzyme, THC synthase, which synthesizes THCA. That enzyme, as you know, is a protein, and proteins are coded by genes. So one way to discriminate at the genotypic level hemp from marijuana would be the genes for THCA synthase, whether they exist or not, whether there's mutations or not. And then there's these epigenetic factors, if they do exist, that could contribute to the expression of that gene.
So the divergence from marijuana to hemp, was that basically a human-controlled thing? Like there were pressures, like I guess in plants, like you can select for like our Mendelian peas, right? Like you can select for pink or white or whatever flower color. Is that what happened between hemp and marijuana? Is that there were people who were cultivating it who selected for certain phenotypic expression?
I would guess. I'm definitely not an expert in this particular area, but yes, I'm assuming that mostly in the U.S. in the 1800s, it was all about hemp. And this idea of smoking marijuana really came from, as far as I understand it, the early 1900s, when these Mexican immigrants came over and introduced this behavior, this substance that could be smoked that had higher levels of THC. But as far as breeding is concerned, that is certainly what has been happening with regard to recreational marijuana, in that we have been constantly trying to breed plants that are high in THC. And as a result of doing that, we have lost biodiversity within the cannabis plant in terms of all of the compounds. And we've also lost cannabinoids, including CBD. I think for a long time, CBD was basically bred out of cannabis, because the purpose for breeding cannabis was to get really high THC containing chemovars. So because the primary use was recreational use. And now that's starting, yeah, exactly, to get high. So now that's starting to change.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about the differences between CBD and THC? And then, this area is, I really rely on you, actually. So when patients come into my office, which happens more and more and more frequently, I think as the regulatory space is expanding and people are feeling more comfortable asking their doctors about it, people ask me and I say, hey, talk to Dr. Corroon, talk to Jamie. He is really the expert in how to dose this and what way to administer it. And so I'm so grateful that you're here to sort of share, because I'm learning a ton as well. What I remember from probably med school when somebody talked about it was that there's a bunch of cannabinoids that aren't CBD or THC that might also be helpful. So are we oversimplifying when we start talking about just CBD and THC? Are there other cannabinoids we need to consider? What's the difference between even just those two if we start there?
Yeah, that's a lot. We're definitely oversimplifying, as we do in medicine and in science when we're trying to explain complex things, or when we're trying to understand them ourselves, let alone explain them to patients or consumers. There are over 100 cannabinoids that have been identified to date. We don't know very much about most of them. We know the most about THC and CBD, but there are others like CBN and CBG and THCV that we are starting to learn more and more about. As most people probably know, that the regulatory status of cannabis or marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance has really hindered our ability to study it. And Schedule I controlled substance, which many people know, is one that value and has a high potential for abuse. Maybe down the road in this conversation, we can tease out whether that's true or not with regard to cannabis. When we talk about these cannabinoids and THC and CBD, we tend to fall into this trap that is the pharmacological model, where we're focusing on one molecule, like what is the active ingredient. And as you said, these compounds exist in a matrix of other compounds inside of a plant. And even when they're extracted and concentrated, you still have a variety of other phytochemicals that are in the matrix that may be modulating the effects of what we believe to be the pharmaceutically active ingredients. But THC and CBD are very, very different. They're both lipids, and they have activity at the cannabinoid receptors, THC much more so than CBD. CBD is really a fascinating tool because it seems to do so many different things. It's very promiscuous in that it has associations or affinities with other types of receptors other than cannabinoid receptors. And so CBD has been shown to have an affinity for GABA receptors and for serotonin receptors and adenosine receptors, etc., whereas that's not quite the case for THC.
So you're talking about in the body, in the human body, and particularly maybe in the human brain, because you talked about GABA, which is a neurotransmitter, but also in the gut, I'm assuming, and maybe that's why we get both psychoactive and GI effects with I was going to say marijuana, but I guess it's CBD and THC, so a wider breadth than I've even considered before. But we're getting those effects because we have inherent in all of us and every human, there are these receptors, right? And then in addition, there's specific cannabinoid receptors.
Right, exactly. So depending on what level you want to approach this. So yes, there are many systems in the body use this ligand receptor model. The ligand is a molecule and the receptor is a target, basically. And the metaphor that we use a lot in medicine and in science is a key and a lock. And the key in this example might be THC or it might be dopamine. And the receptor is like the lock. And there are different ways that these ligands or these molecules can interact with the receptor. They can, the key can be into the lock and nothing can happen. The key can be put into the lock and it can block other keys from getting put into the lock. The key can get put into the lock and it can get turned and something can happen inside the cell. And THC, when it comes to cannabinoid receptors, and cannabinoid receptors, like other receptors, sit on the cell surface of a variety of different cells. We talk mostly about nerve cells or neurons, but cannabinoid receptors are found in all sorts of tissues, as you said, in the gut, on white blood cells, immune cells. And so it's a very distributed system throughout the body. But a lot of times when we are talking about it, we're talking about the central nervous system.
Wow, there is so much complexity here. I'm glad I just refer people to you because this is a lot. Like, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed already just by how much there is to bite off here. And I think, as you were talking about that complexity, there's this paradox or maybe just differing paradigms between like an herbalist perspective where you might have a lot of reverence for the plants, for the synergies that are within those plants the way they are. So as opposed to the pharmaceutical paradigm where, okay, what we want is that single active molecule separate from everything else, and we're going to go see what that does at this receptor site. So we're kind of hanging in this balance between, do we use the whole plant? Do we take out that one molecule and just study that? I mean, and then you do end up with this really, really complex system if you're talking about the whole plant in the whole body versus just trying to get maybe one effect on a neurotransmitter when you take out a single active ingredient or single active, did you say they're ligands or ligands?
Yeah.
There's a lot of meat on this to kind of explore. So tell me more.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to, it is extremely confusing and complex, and it's overwhelming for me too. And I don't know how much the audience knows, but a few things to touch on based upon what you just said. With regard to THC and CBD, there is, in our reductionist view of things, like we talked about when we're trying to simplify complex systems, there's a phenomenon that's occurring now where people are saying that CBD is medical cannabis and THC is recreational cannabis. And I think Sanjay Gupta in his special on CNN called Weed, just had one a few months ago called Weed 4. He was really kind of doing this, and I don't think it's fair because that's a gross oversimplification. THC and CBD are both cannabinoids. They have a variety of different effects in the body. There's some overlap in terms of what they do. Both are anticonvulsants. Both are analgesics, both are anti-inflammatories, but there's a lot of effects that THC has that CBD does not have that are very important clinically. It's just that THC happens to have this side effect that can occur even at a very low dose, which may be adverse effect for some people, which may be a desired effect for other people. And then with regard to these two cannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors, and I don't want to get too complex, but THC binds to a site on the cannabinoid 1 receptor so as to initiate an intracellular cascade. The key goes in the lock turns, something happens. This is the orthosteric site. And then CBD binds to the cannabinoid receptor 1, but it binds to a different site. It binds to the allosteric site. And an allosteric modulator is a compound that binds to that site and it changes the conformation of the receptor so that other ligands like THC have a different affinity for the receptor. And so there is this idea that I'm sure you have heard that when you administer THC on its own as an isolate, there is some certain set of effects. But when you administer with CBD, those effects are different. And that potentially could be explained by the fact that CBD changes the shape of the receptor so that the effects of THC are different.
That is fascinating. So, just so everyone will stay with us as we go further into the weeds here, tell me a little bit more about the benefits, and also how you got into this. Like, you're clearly very passionate about this area of medicine. You went through the whole naturopathic doctorate program and then a master's in public health, and really your niche has become cannabis, and medical cannabis specifically. How did you end up there?
I think mostly it just came from my own personal experience. I always loved smoking weed, just to be very direct. I mean, I never really cared too much about alcohol, and I enjoyed the effects. I liked how I felt when I used cannabis. But when I was 32, I suffered a life-changing neck injury, which you know about, a very serious, and I had about 3 or 4 years where I was in very severe chronic pain. I was experiencing a lot of disability. I was in neck braces. I was either preparing for surgeries or having surgeries or doing physical therapy. And I was on a lot of drugs to help with the pain and the depression and muscle spasms and everything. And one of the interventions that really helped me a lot was cannabis. And there's obviously a lot more complexity to that story, but that was the experience that led me to get into medicine. I used to work in the technology industry and in finance, but I started to study things, enzymes and biochemistry and physiology. And to make a long story short, when I got out of naturopathic medical school, I knew that I needed to understand statistics because I have to understand things. It's just kind of how I am, and a lot of the interventions that we use in the world of complementary and alternative medicine are subject to a lot of personal beliefs, and so I wanted to be able to break down the research and be able to understand what was fact and what was opinion. And then with regard to cannabis, I just felt like this was an area that I could be very helpful, because what was happening in 2015, 2016 was that this was getting a lot of attention in the popular press. It was on NPR, it was on CNN, it was in USA Today.
There's Netflix documentaries all over about it.
And a lot of people who had lived for decades hearing that this was a substance that was a threat to society, that was something that was deleterious to our personal health. They were hearing a completely different story, and these people were sick, and they were wondering, wait a minute, is this something that can help me? And they were going to their doctors, and their doctors didn't know anything about it. And as a result, they were ending up in dispensaries talking to bud tenders and to sales reps for cannabis products or product manufacturers. And many of these people are very smart and very committed and well-intentioned, but they're not trained in medicine. And so I just felt like there was a real need to help patients, and that given our background as naturopathic doctors with our training in botanical medicines and the fact that this is a botanical medicine, that this was a good place for me to focus. And so what I did basically was I took advantage of a data set that Lori Meashley and Michelle Sexton, 2 other naturopathic doctors, had collected over time with regard to cannabis use, medical cannabis use. And I took the data set and analyzed data and wrote a paper and got it published. And then I was sort of on my way in this field.
Great. So talk about some of the benefits. I certainly had these sweet little old ladies coming in asking me about cannabis as they heard about it on all of the media that you were talking about. And I didn't know what to tell them really. And so I sent them to you. But they were coming in with anxiety, certainly around cancer. sleep issues, lots and lots of different complaints would attract the attention of someone who would draw people to consider cannabis. And so can you tell me about some of the things that maybe there is published literature on that would be beneficial to maybe consider that as a treatment?
Yeah, well, there's different ways of approaching this. If you look at surveys of individuals who are using cannabis for medical purposes, they will report to you that the top reasons that they are using cannabis is for pain, anxiety, depression, sleep, and then cancer, probably. In most studies, those are like the top 5 right there.
Is it in that order, or is that kind of arbitrary?
It's usually in that order. It's usually in that order. We also have drugs that have made their way through the FDA drug approval process that have been developed for certain clinical indications. So in 1986, I think it was, the FDA approved a drug named dronabinol. That's the generic name, dronabinol, which is synthetic THC. It has the same chemical formula and the same chemical structure as THC that is synthesized in nature by the cannabis sativa plant.
And this was an FDA-approved drug for what indication?
It was first approved for nausea and vomiting associated with cancer chemotherapy in patients that had failed traditional antiemetics, which are anti-nausea meds. And then I think the indication was extended in 1992 to include patients with HIV and AIDS who were suffering from anorexia, loss of appetite, and cachexia, which is the loss of muscle mass that comes from wasting, basically, when you're not eating. And so this drug, at least according to the FDA, was safe and effective for reducing nausea and vomiting and stimulating appetite. And so just to draw back to a few moments ago, the DEA still says it has no medical value, yet the FDA has approved it for at least 2 indications. So, you could be thinking about using THC for both of those reasons, either to stimulate appetite or to reduce nausea and vomiting, and those are pretty common uses as well. There is a drug.
Excuse me. So with that drug, dronabinol with a D, is that what you said?
Yeah.
So does that have psychoactive effects? Because you mentioned that THC has more psychoactive effects than CBD. So somebody getting that drug administered in a hospital for either the cachexia or nausea and vomiting, would they feel high?
Yeah, depending on the dose and depending upon the person's sensitivity. But, this dronabinol is one of the pillars in the isolate versus whole plant extract argument. And so a lot of people will say that even if you took the same dose of THC, let's just say it's 5 milligrams, if you take it as isolated THC in the form of dronabinol, a synthetic THC, or if you take it as isolated THC in the form of delta-9 THC synthesized in a plant, your risk for adverse effects is higher than if you took that same 5 milligrams in a whole plant extract with all of the other cannabinoids, all of the terpenes and terpenoids and the other compounds in there. And so many people like to say...
So can you just describe the risk?
Yeah, so the risk would be the risk of adverse effects. And the most common adverse effect, well, I guess it is kind of individual, but the most common adverse effects that you hear with regard to THC are sedation, lethargy, so feeling tired and fatigued, memory loss, difficulty concentrating, dizziness, paranoia, hunger is an adverse effect for a lot of people, increased heart rate, tachycardia. And so many people like to say that if you look at the dronabinol studies, you see that the risk for adverse effects is higher than people who use THC dominant cannabis. But we don't actually have a study that compares those two things.
Okay. So there hasn't been a head-to-head. But generally, even in the published literature on both of those, that holds true.
In terms of those adverse effects?
Yeah. So what you see in the general literature around cannabis as a whole plant versus what you see in the literature that is on dronabinol or the isolated THC, generally what you're seeing is this difference. So you're in like a sort of pseudo meta-analysis. There's not a head-to-head study, but overall in the analyses, if you compare those two groups, there's more adverse events reported in one than the other. Is that what I'm understanding?
I actually have not done that. I'm just saying that that's what people will say.
Interesting.
THC is not a good drug. And the reason why THC is not a good drug is because it has a very narrow therapeutic window. It's a great drug in the sense that it has a lot of different effects. It's very versatile. It can do many things. And typically, if you recommend it for one thing like pain, the patient will come back to you and say, well, I also experienced improved sleep, and I also experienced reduced anxiety. So it's great that it has multiple different effects. But you can't go high in the dosing range on it because people tend to get high. And for a lot of people, that's an adverse effect. On the other hand, CBD is a good drug in the sense that you could go really high in terms of the dosing without people experiencing adverse effects.
So is there
and the
a
most
CBD?
common adverse sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. A common adverse effect with CBD?
Yeah, well, the most common adverse effects with CBD is also sedation, feeling fatigued. But it's much less common to feel an adverse effect if you're using a CBD dominant product as opposed to a THC dominant product.
And is there a CBD comparable to like the dronabinol that is a FDA approved, regulated synthetic CBD?
Yes, that's. I don't know if you're setting me up for this or what, but
No.
there was one that was just approved on January 25th, I think.
Oh, wow.
It's called Epidiolex. It is manufactured by GW Pharmaceuticals. The U.S. subsidiary is Greenwich Biosciences. They're here in Carlsbad. It is the first FDA-approved drug that is derived from marijuana. It's derived not from hemp, but from marijuana. It's an isolated CBD in sesame oil. It's 99% CBD. And it was approved to treat 2 intractable seizure disorders in pediatric patients, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome. And in, I think it was 3 phase 3 clinical trials, it showed to be pretty effective at reducing the frequency and even the severity of seizures in these patients. It was designated as an orphan drug, which allowed it to be accelerated through the drug approval process. And so we don't actually have a lot of participants in those 3 phase 3 clinical trials. But the interesting thing, in addition to what I said, that the fact that the FDA has approved a marijuana-derived drug, is that it's actually going to force rescheduling of CBD, and this actually could lead into another very complex part of this conversation. But the DEA has until September 24th. They have 90 days basically to reschedule CBD, because obviously now CBD has to be able to be prescribed, and you can't prescribe a Schedule 1 controlled substance because it has no medical value. And so CBD will be rescheduled, which is very exciting, and there's a lot of speculation as to where it will end up. Maybe Schedule 4, maybe Schedule 3.
Well, can we go into, you alluded to this whole, is it addictive, is it not? And that's part of how they determine how to schedule certain medications or drugs, right? Like opiates and benzodiazepines are scheduled the way they are because there's a high risk of abuse. Thank you. So they're Schedule 2, right? Because they have some medical benefit, but they high risk of abuse. So when we talk about cannabis and this potential for rescheduling, what is the literature around abuse potential?
Well, as far as cannabis itself,
yeah, or THC and
CBD,
CBD, are they different? Are they showing differences when they do the research?
it's really complicated because if we talk about cannabis as a medicine or as a drug, it's obviously a combination drug. It has a variety of different compounds, and there are other combination drugs out there that have been approved. But to answer these questions, we break it down into individual components, and then we fall into the trap of like the isolate versus the whole plant extract. So it's really difficult to talk about all of this. But you know, in most evaluations of a particular drug's potential for abuse, it's measured, and again, I'm not an expert in this particular area, but it's measured in animal models where they give rats usually access to a substance, and then they offer them food, and then they look to see whether the rats self-administer the substance over the food. And like rats, for example, and I haven't read these studies, so I'm just usually basically going on other people that have told me this and things that I've read that aren't the actual studies. They will hit the bottle to take cocaine until they starve to death, right? And so with regard to THC, there does seem to be some abuse potential there, but not so with CBD. In 2017, the World Health Organization put out this very comprehensive preliminary report on CBD in an effort to try to, I think, set the groundwork for descheduling CBD worldwide in terms of the World Health Organization. And they concluded after reviewing the research that there's no abuse potential for CBD. But we also, there is a difference between dependence, tolerance, and addiction, and we should probably just tease those things out, because tolerance is the physiological adaptation when we are exposed to a given substance.
This would be like coffee or sugar.
Yeah, nicotine, caffeine, whatever the case may be. At some point over time, you need a higher dose in order to maintain the same effect, because the body is adapting to it. And then dependence, which is oftentimes confused with addiction, is basically the appearance of withdrawal symptoms when we abstain from using the substance or performing the behavior.
So an example would be like if somebody who gets the shakes after not having alcohol.
Yeah, exactly.
Or a headache after not having coffee.
Yes. Yeah, and then addiction is really a behavioral disorder. It's this inability to stop using the substance or performing the behavior, despite the fact that there are negative consequences, despite the acknowledgement of those consequences, this compulsive, impulsive use of the substance or performing the behavior. And, THC, you can develop tolerance to THC, you can develop dependence to THC, and you can become addicted to THC. The withdrawal symptoms from THC are much more similar to, say, caffeine withdrawal than even nicotine withdrawal or alcohol withdrawal. I mean, I don't know if you've ever experienced someone who was giving up nicotine, but they can be a monster, and that's typically not the case with THC. And with CBD, I don't honestly know. I don't really know how much we know about that, but I don't think that there's much of a dependence with CBD.
Okay, interesting. So that may influence how it becomes scheduled in the next 90 days. Now, do you have any idea, and you can say no, but if they don't hit that deadline, if the federal government doesn't hit that deadline for whatever reason, then will this drug not be released, or what will happen?
They'll hit it. The head of the DEA said flatly they're going to do it. Okay. So it's going to happen. And even then, the drug is going to be very expensive. These anti-epileptic drugs are very expensive generally. So insurance coverage will certainly be important. It's not clear, even with insurance coverage, how affordable it will be. It's not clear how comfortable they will feel using it off-label for other things. But it's a very exciting development, and it creates a lot of uncertainty in the hemp-derived CBD world, which is a world that you know a bit about. And certainly more people are using CBD that's derived from hemp than they are using CBD that's derived from marijuana, or CBD that's about to be available through physicians via e-prescription.
So there is a whole spectrum, and this is another part of it that totally confuses me, is like, how do you know what you're getting? So I guess if you get a pharmaceutical, there's a tracking system, there's a lot number, there's a pharmacy that it came from, and there's a lot of regulation around what happens to that substance. Now, if you go into a dispensary, like here in California or Oregon or Washington or Colorado, how do you know what you're getting? And, when I start to think about plants, even when we're talking about a zucchini, and like how many pesticides or herbicides did this get sprayed with? And then when you talk about consuming something like cannabis, how many pesticides or herbicides did that get sprayed with? And then are you going to expose yourself to toxins? I'm going in a lot of directions here, but there's so many different pieces to consider with what you're getting. How do you know what you're getting? And there is this financial piece. Like you just mentioned, this drug, the CBD analog, is going to be super, super expensive. And so maybe not even accessible to a child that has epilepsy. And so then are they going to go to a dispensary and get that? And will it be a good product? And how do we know?
Yeah, and will it be available over the counter if it's a hemp-derived product, or online, or at a dispensary? Because once it's approved as a drug, presumably it cannot be sold as a dietary supplement, or even, in a cannabis product. Like, you can't go somewhere and buy lovastatin or hydrochlorothiazide in something that is not approved by the FDA. But that is what's going to happen, at least come September. September 24th, when we all wake up, you can go to your doctor, and if you qualify, get a prescription for CBD. You can go to the health food store and buy CBD, and you could go to a licensed dispensary in a state that has a medical or recreational cannabis law and buy CBD there too. And those are three different sources, and they're regulated three totally different ways. And if you had a patent on CBD, like Greenwich Biosciences or Greenwich GW Pharmaceuticals, you might not want people to be able to go to the store and get CBD. So if I go to my doctor and I have health insurance and they say, okay, well, it's $175 a month for you to use this drug, you might go to the health food store and say, well, I can get it over the counter for $80 a month. And I'm just speculating. So there's a lot of concern and confusion about what's going to happen with regard to CBD outside of the prescribing or the prescriptive right of the physician. But anyway, to answer your question, so how do we know what's in the products that we buy? I think it really depends on the state that you live in and the regulations. In California, where we live, if you are buying a cannabis-based product at a licensed dispensary, that product has to be tested by a third party, and those test results, which are a batch, it's testing a batch, have to be made available to you. And a lot of companies are really trying to make this as transparent as possible. They're putting the lot number or the batch number on the box of their products. They're offering websites where you can go in and you could put in the batch number, and you can look at a chemical analysis that not only breaks down the cannabinoid content, the absolute concentration and the absolute amount, but also you can look at pesticides, you can look at heavy metals, and I mean, not look at it, this is required, and microbial testing as well. There are other companies that are putting scanner codes on their labels, so you can scan it with your phone and automatically you can pull up a certificate of analysis. And so, California really has very strong regulations with regard to lab testing, which is awesome. And if you want, as a consumer, you can have access to that information. Now, you could walk into Whole Foods tomorrow and you could see 9 bottles of, CoQ10 on the shelf with other things in them. Can you get a certificate of analysis for those? No, you can't. So I think in a lot of ways, the cannabis products are going to have greater scrutiny and more resources available for purchasers than other dietary supplements and in some cases, maybe even other drugs. That's
really interesting and probably very beneficial for the consumer to know. So I have questions around dosing and administration. So now we're getting into this area of like walking into a dispensary, and even like Whole Foods, you can walk into Whole Foods or even Walmart and there are CBD products. So how do you know which would be the right one for you, or even where to start? When there is, you can vape it, you can drink it, it can be raw, it can be, the list goes on and on. It can be edibles. It can be heated, it can be not, like where these ratios of CBD to THC, and then you get into all of these like funky names of different things. Where do you start?
Where do I start in terms of answering that question?
So let's take my little old lady. So I have an 80-year-old patient who walks in and she's like in pain. She's got arthritis. She has some nausea from another medication that she's taking. So it's a side effect from another medication. She doesn't really have an appetite anymore. She has been losing some weight, but not too much. She's not cachexic. And then she has some difficulty sleeping at night. So she's like, wow, I read something, or my nephew told me something about cannabis and how it's helped him. What should she do? Where should she go? Where should she get more information?
Okay, so if our clinical objective would be to reduce nausea and stimulate appetite, at least this is just how I would approach this. We were thinking about cannabis as the intervention here, I would be thinking about THC, not so much CBD, because THC really is more effective in those two areas than CBD is. I don't think that CBD stimulates appetite. That has not been shown in the Epidiolex studies. It really hasn't been shown in terms of reducing nausea as well. So I'd be first thinking about THC. And then, as far as so that means we're now buying a product in a licensed dispensary, okay?
What about her arthritis?
Sorry, I didn't hear that part.
Yeah,
so if that's the case as well, I still think we're probably going to use THC. If she didn't have those other two symptoms and she just had arthritis, then we would be thinking about CBD, and probably from hemp, because it's accessible, it's affordable, and it's not going to lead to any kind of impairment. So I'm already worried that this little old lady is going to fall down. I'm worried she's going to get dizzy and fall down. So I'm worried about using THC. So already the first objective is to be able to give her a dose of THC that is not going to lead to impairment. And there is this sort of dichotomy now, as I said before, where people think like, well, if you take CBD, you don't get high. If you take THC, you get high. That's not the case. Everything depends on the dose. The effects of THC are dose dependent. So you could take a dose of THC and not feel high, just the same way you could take a sip of a glass of wine and not get drunk, right? So it depends on how much you're taking. The analgesic properties of THC will also help with her arthritis, and CBD will not help with her anorexia and her nausea. So we're going to go with a product that she's going to buy at a dispensary, and it gets really complex in terms of access. But I would start with trying to determine a dose of THC that is not going to make her feel anything, because that's my first goal in a situation like this. Do no harm. Demonstrate that she can take THC without feeling impaired. And then from there, I would very slowly inch it up. And that's why this is a very difficult therapy or modality to use in clinical practice, because it requires a lot of hand-holding. But that is basically how I would approach that. And, you talked about all of these different products. The method of administration is really important. And the method of administration is important for a lot of different reasons. One is that it determines the difference between the dose that is administered and the dose that is actually received. So just because you ingest 10 milligrams of THC or 5 milligrams of Valium doesn't mean that amount is received in the body, right? It's only some portion of it is going to be absorbed. Some other portion is going to be metabolized in the liver. So your method of administration really determines this difference between what you take and what you actually receive. Because if you're inhaling it, the diffusion through the vascular system in the lungs will allow you to absorb a lot more of it, as compared to, let's say, the gut, where you're going to absorb less of it, and as compared to the dermis, where you're going to absorb even less of that.
So like a topical administration to a sore thumb or knee.
Yeah, basically I break it down like inhalation as a method of administration, which includes smoking and vaping, and then oral administration, which includes oral absorption like sublingual absorption and buccal mucosal absorption, and then enteral absorption, which is basically ingesting it, and then dermal, which is topical, and transdermal. And topical is, like you said, it's applied to something that's cutaneous, like a rash or a scratch or perhaps an inflamed joint, whereas a transdermal would be seeking a systemic effect like a nicotine patch or hormone patch, and you would put it in a highly vascular area, not the place where the problem is. And the pharmacokinetics are different for all of these methods of administration. So bioavailability is one component of pharmacokinetics. And as we said, you're going to absorb, or a different amount is going to be bioavailable depending upon the method of administration. And also, whether it goes to the liver or not is going to also have a huge impact, because another part of pharmacokinetics is metabolism. We have all of these enzymes in our liver that receive whatever is absorbed through the small intestine. And basically the objective of these enzymes is to modify these compounds so the body can eliminate them. And the body mostly tries to turn these compounds into water-soluble compounds so that we can eliminate them via urine or sweat or via expiration. These cannabinoids are lipids, however, and so it's difficult for the body to get rid of them. But one thing that happens in that metabolism in the liver to THC is that it is converted to a metabolite 11-hydroxy-THC, which is much more potent at the CB1 receptor. It's 3 to 7 times more potent. And that's why you hear a lot of people report a very different experience when they ingest a cannabis product as opposed to inhaling it or applying it topically. Because
okay, I just have to ask because I'm curious and like giggling to myself. Is this like a full-on dazed and confused moment? Like this is why people get so high after having a brownie or whatever it is. It's like the classic 70s hippie movie where like it's all disastrous and there's munchies and they can't talk to anybody, and it's because of that secondary metabolite after the liver. Is that right? Am I drawing the right connections?
For the most part, yes. I mean, there's now, there's dabbing. There's such high concentrated extracts that can be inhaled that you could get a really high dose of delta 9 THC that would lead to that level of impairment. But for the most part, yes, we're talking about someone who ingests something, sitting around waiting, doesn't think anything is really happening, and then, within a few moments, they're completely floored and they can't do anything. And that is, I think, to a large degree, an effect that's mediated by this metabolite of THC, 11-hydroxy.
That sounds like an adverse event. We'd want to avoid that.
Depends on the person and the situation.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so I think the duration of that effect is also longer. Most people, most older people, most patients don't want to inhale. The real benefit of inhaling is that you feel the effects right away, and you're going to absorb more of the active ingredients in whatever you're using. The downside is that it doesn't last as long. The benefit to ingesting it is that you're going to have a greater duration of effect, and you're probably going to have to use a lower dose, but it takes a while to feel the effects. A lot of patients will use a variety of different methods of administration. If you're in chronic pain and you're taking opioids throughout the day and you go to sleep at night and you wake up in the morning and you haven't medicated in 8 hours or whatever it may be, and you're in a lot of pain, you might not want to sit around for an hour or an hour and a half for your orally administered product to kick in. And so in that situation, you might use an inhaled product and then use an oral product as well. And the promise of these sublingually absorbed products and these buccal mucosally absorbed products is that it's some sort of hybrid in terms of the onset of effect between inhalation and ingestion. But even then, we actually don't have really good data on that, and a lot of people don't actually feel the onset of any kind of effects in the time frame that is often advertised. Like they typically say, 10, 12, 15 minutes, you should feel something, and a lot of people don't feel any difference.
So when I talk to patients about this, I do have concerns around the inhalation and the risk that could be associated with that, whether you're smoking a cigarette or taking a bong rip. I feel like there are these particulates, right? Like these burnt particulate that is going into your lungs and has the potential to be really harmful, even though you're getting this potential benefit. Can you speak to that? Like, would it be better to vape? Do we know vaping's relatively new? So if you're talking about this inhalation administration, is there one that's safer than the other?
Yes. I don't know how, I don't really know that we have the data to compare inhalation to smoking in terms of safety yet. I think from a theoretical standpoint, I think we can draw the conclusion that it's probably a better idea to vape than to smoke. In California, according to Prop 65, smoked cannabis is a carcinogen. It contains itself, the substance is a carcinogen, and it contains a variety of carcinogens that are also on that Prop 65 list. And the risk of vaping really is what else is in that cartridge. What other excipients are used to dilute the oil so that it can be less viscous and so that it can work better with regard to the heating element and it can be vaporized. And, a lot of times we look to the e-cigarette industry in terms of safety because mostly these excipients are propylene glycol or polyethylene glycol or vegetable glycerin. And sometimes MCT oil is used. And really, as far as I understand it, I've looked at some of this literature, it has to do more with the temperature in the heating element as opposed to the compound itself. There was an article that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, I think it was a couple years ago, that was indicating that propylene glycol was being converted to formaldehyde. And that formaldehyde was being inhaled and it was causing negative health effects, or at least it had the potential to do so. But the temperatures were like, 700 or 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And the boiling point for THC is around 300. I've seen 315, I've seen 280. So if the objective is to get THC, cannabinoids, and terpenes, you certainly don't need to be vaporizing at a temperature up in 700 where the propylene glycol might get converted to formaldehyde or some other toxic substance. So
you need somebody with a brain to put the vape together to make sure that you're getting to the right temperature, or to, as a consumer, have the knowledge of what you just explained to make sure that you're getting a vape that gets at the right temperature to get those terpenes into an aerosolized, like into something that you can inhale and not get the other things you don't want. Now, sorry to interrupt, but I also have a question around, are they flavoring them? Do we need to worry about the flavorings they're doing with the e-cigarettes? Is that an issue?
Yes, potentially. So a lot of times what they're doing is through the extraction process, all of these different phytochemicals have a different point at which they are able to be extracted. And the individuals who are operating these extraction systems are using variables like pressure and temperature and time to determine what fractions of these chemicals they want to extract. And with terpenes, which are the organoleptic compounds, they're the compounds that give cannabis the flavor and the taste and the smell, the aromas. These compounds are highly volatile. They have boiling points, and the boiling point is the temperature at which it goes from a liquid to a gas that are very low. Some of them are at room temperature. And so they are much more likely to be lost during the extraction process as gas at lower temperatures. And so what happens a lot of times is they will run extractions in order to basically get THC. And so they'll use the temperature, pressure, and time that's going to optimize that fraction for extraction. And then they'll get the THC, and then they will add back terpenes in order to try to enhance the flavor or perhaps even replicate the terpene profile of the original starting material. And a lot of times those terpenes come from cannabis, maybe even that same cannabis flower, or from other cannabis flower, but sometimes they come from other foods. And we don't really know how safe it is to be inhaling the concentrations of terpenes that we're seeing in those cartridges, because we know people have been inhaling smoked cannabis for a long time, and there are terpenes that they're inhaling as a part of that process. But in a concentrate, you have, a much greater dose of those terpenes as you do THC and other cannabinoids. If you were to pull out a gram of cannabis flower that was 25% THC, you would say, wow, that's really potent. But if you look at a gram of an extract, it's probably 80 or 90% THC. So everything gets concentrated in an extract, including terpenes. And so we really don't have people who have, over long periods of time, inhaled the dose of terpenes and terpenoids that they're getting in a cartridge.
Got it. So there's a lot of gray area here. Basically, there's a lot we don't know about vaping, about these cartridges, about these new routes of administration that are coming out. And it's just, we're left with a big question mark. We'll have to see.
Yeah, the other thing too is some of these fertilizers and pesticides that have been approved, that are used in cultivation, they were approved for like tomatoes, where you might ingest residues of these chemicals. They weren't approved to be inhaled, right? So there's that as well, and that's part of the reason why in many of these states, or most of these states, there are requirements for testing for a large amount and a wide variety of different synthetic chemicals like that.
And that makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious, you have a master's in public health, and I would like to get your take. I think some of the literature that you've published, since you publish research, is in this public health space. Like, what is the role of cannabis in the opioid epidemic in that context? And what do you think the role of cannabis is as the regulatory space changes so much? How do you see that playing into public health, either issues maybe that would come up or some benefits?
That's a really good question, probably a bit of both, and it will take time for us to really answer those questions. As far as the opioid epidemic is concerned, I think that cannabis certainly will play a role in helping to curb this systemic problem. And it's great that over the last year or so many important people, politicians, clinicians, researchers have really brought, and journalists, frankly, have brought this issue to light. Cannabis, I think, from a variety of different perspectives, has already proven to be a reliable solution. It's not the solution by any means whatsoever, but we have a lot of disparate types of data and different research methodologies that indicate that individuals are using cannabis as a substitute for prescription opioids. As a result, they're able to use lower doses of those opioids. They're able to experience fewer side effects of the opioids. In many cases, they're able to stop using them. There are epidemiological studies that show that individuals who live in states with medical marijuana laws, that have access to medical marijuana or medical cannabis through dispensaries, are, as a result, not getting written as many prescriptions for opioids by their doctors. There's Medicare Part D data that supports that. There's Medicaid data that says the same thing, that generally speaking in these states, there's fewer opioid prescriptions being written. There's data that shows that there are fewer hospitalizations for opioid overdoses. There's fewer admissions to opioid treatment programs for opioid use disorders. There's lower mortality in states that have access to legal medical cannabis for the residents of those states. And we have some clinical trials, which are the gold standard in medicine and research, that show that actual research participants who are using opioids are able to use a lower dose. They're able to delay tolerance that might build up over time with exposure to an opioid. So I think it's definitely helping. How much it's going to help. My mind's
a little bit blown right now. Like, I don't think I realized that there was that much literature spanning that much breadth that was so supportive of this. So, am I clear that, like, pretty much every single thing you listed said that if you compare states with legal access to medical cannabis to states without, so, like, let's take I don't know if this has been done, but like Colorado versus West Virginia, this might be part of the explanation for why the opioid epidemic is hitting some states worse than others, is because medical cannabis can potentially play a role in people, and maybe not even potentially. Are you saying that the literature is saying that unequivocally there is a difference in how often people have overdose events and how often people get prescribed opiates and how often people go to the hospital? Is that really what you just said?
Well, I'm
is
smiling
it that clear?
because you probably know me well enough. I would never use the word unequivocal because I'm so cynical. But well, no. I mean, I'm saying that there is
because I know your degree of skepticism and how much it takes for us to overcome some threshold to make you be convinced of the benefit of something. Like that's part of why I'm sort of shocked right now that you just listed so many amazing potential benefits at an epidemiological level, like where this might have the potential to help solve the opioid epidemic and potentially the benzo epidemic. I don't know if there's literature there, but I think that's sort of the next wave of this opioid crisis is the benzos. And like what you just said, it was powerful.
Yeah. I mean, just to summarize, my personal opinion after looking at published data on this particular question is I definitely think, my own personal opinion, that cannabis is a part of the solution. How big a part of the solution remains to be seen. This is a very, very complex problem. It's a very widespread problem. But I think that cannabis can be a part of the solution, and I think we have enough data from enough different sources to conclude that. On the flip side, and this goes to the other part of your question, cannabis is not all good, right? We said you can become addicted to THC. You can develop dependence to THC. THC and alcohol are not a good match because alcohol tends to dilate your blood vessels, and oftentimes that leads to greater absorption for THC. So THC and alcohol can have this potentiation when you use them together, and there's a lot of people using alcohol, and alcohol is really a problem from an individual and a public health perspective. There's this whole issue of teenagers and children who have developing central nervous systems, and whether having legalized access, recreational and or medical, to cannabis in the states where they live is going to lead to increased usage and perhaps affect their cognitive development. Driving under the influence.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, there's a lot of potential issues on the downside to cannabis. So I don't want to make it just sound like it's a miracle. But I do think with regard to the opioid epidemic, I think it can be very helpful.
Thank you for the balance there. Has anyone ever died from cannabis overdose? I don't even know the answer.
Oh, this is awesome. I love this. I love being able to cite the DEA as the source for this. You can go to the DEA. They have drug monographs for illicit substances. And if you download the marijuana drug monograph from the DEA, it says there has never been a reported overdose death of or from marijuana. So,
oh, wow.
So far, the answer is no.
Okay. Wow. So from a public health perspective, there's a lot of potential here.
Yeah, there's a lot of potential for good. There's some potential from harm. My personal opinion is that the benefits are going to outweigh the harms. The really interesting thing, I find this so fascinating. You would think that if you were to allow recreational use, legal access for non-medical use in states, that it would be easier for teenagers to get access to cannabis, and as a result, teenagers would be using cannabis more regularly. That just makes sense to me. But we know so far, looking at data from Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, that that's not actually happening. What they do is they survey 12 to 17-year-olds and then different age groups, but they survey them and they ask them, have you used cannabis in the past month? And so usually they're looking at the percentage of those survey respondents that report past month use. And they're comparing before it was legalized in Colorado, like before 2014. And then they're looking at 2015 versus 2016, 2017. And they're not really showing an increase in that particular statistic. So
that's surprising.
Yeah, it's definitely surprising and a little bit confounding. And with a lot of this stuff, it takes time to sort it out. Part of the hope is that in legalizing this, the state of California will collect tax revenue that will fund research that will answer some of these important public health questions.
As a clinician, I see a lot of brain stuff, right? Neurocognitive, certainly everything from autism and ADD affecting young kids, oppositional defiance, all the way to anxiety, depression in middle age, and then Alzheimer's at the end of life. And one of my big concerns is the effect of the medications that are commonly prescribed to young children, right? The Adderall at 5 or 6 years old as they're starting school. What effect does that have on a developing brain? And THC or CBD, these products, I wouldn't exclude from that. I think that I have a real fear around what happens to a developing brain if you start adding all these substances and these super physiologic doses of neurotransmitters or things that bind neurotransmitter receptor sites, and can you have a permanent effect on that human's potential for the rest of their life by altering that? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. I have the same concern.
And do we know, is there any literature that suggests that?
Well, I think we have literature that suggests that could be dangerous or detrimental with regard to THC. But the great thing about THC, if you want to look at it this way, is that it doesn't take a lot to have an adverse effect, and so it's really hard to give a very high dose of THC to a kid. And no one, well, I can't say no one is really doing that, but the doses of THC that are being used, and I'm not doing that, I'll say that, but are very small.
Okay. Yeah. Can you tell us where you sort of start with dosing? I know you're not giving medical advice on a podcast.
Yeah, definitely.
But...
Well, I mean, here's what I say, like, there's obviously a therapeutic objective. I want to reduce pain. I want to improve sleep, whatever the case may be. And most people have multiple therapeutic objectives. But we don't even know, if we're talking about THC, if we can achieve those objectives without hitting their tolerance threshold. Some people feel the intoxicating effects of THC and they like the way they feel. Some people feel them and they hate the way they feel. Some people are in between. So really the governing factor is how sensitive a person is to THC and how they feel about its effects. And so the way I think about dosing for THC is, first and foremost, I'm thinking about safety and tolerability. And there are situations where patients cannot achieve the therapeutic objectives because they can't tolerate the adverse effects.
So it's not a good medication for them then? It's not really a good intervention.
No.
You'd have to try something else.
Yeah.
Okay. So say I'm someone who suffers from insomnia and I live in Nebraska. There's no access. Is there access in Nebraska? I'm totally making that up. I'm assuming that it doesn't have access. It's terrible.
You pick West Virginia, you pick Nebraska.
Well, West Virginia.
Hopefully no one's listening from those states.
No, hopefully someone is. That's kind of like, that would be part of my goal here is like, and then why I'm asking this question. So say someone lives in a state where there's absolutely no access and they are vacationing in Colorado and they do get access for a week. Is it something that they might be able to try and see if, okay, is this worth the benefit? Or is it going to take 6 months or a month to get any benefit?
No, it a little bit depends on the context, what the objective is, and which.
Okay, so like sleep. I can't sleep. I've got a terrible insomnia.
Yes, if we're talking about THC and or CBD dominant products, and you want to understand if they may help your sleep, within a couple of nights, I think you can have you could be on your way to answering that question.
Okay.
If we're talking about cancer, well, then how would we know after a couple of nights? But
arthritis, would we know pretty quickly with arthritis? Certainly anxiety, depression, would we know?
Anxiety and depression are a little bit more difficult because, as you know, these symptoms are so variable anyway. Some days you wake up and you feel more anxious than the day before, and it's difficult to know why. And so even if you did feel an effect on the first day after using CBD or THC, whatever the case may be, we don't actually know that it's because of the CBD. And so you would need a longer period of time, I think, to be able to draw a causal relationship. But you may feel an effect right away.
Okay, and pain was the number one thing that you listed when you talked about potential indications. What about with pain?
Yes, I think, assuming we can handle the tolerance issue, I think within a couple of doses, you should be able to feel some pain. I mean, honestly, I think pain relief is very easily achieved with cannabis. I don't mean total resolution, but I mean improvements in pain. And there's this whole other element in terms of the mechanisms. There is a difference between pain and suffering. In pain management, we talk about how pain is simply a sensation. It's a noxious stimulus. And suffering is the psycho-emotional response to this stimulus. And I think from a mechanistic standpoint, we have data to rely on to say that we have a general understanding how THC and CBD, but more so THC, might help reduce pain. But on the flip side, I think THC also is a very important compound for reducing suffering. The euphoria, the distraction, the forgetfulness that can occur, I think those can be therapeutic in that perspective.
Making people's lives better through amnesia? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, think about if we remembered all of the horrible things that occurred in our lives, like we would probably be catatonic. So
fair enough.
Exactly.
Okay, so what else do you want to add? I mean, there's so much complexity here. I feel like we could go in lots of directions for hours, but what else do you think would be most important for someone who's just kind of learning about cannabis to know?
Well, we can't go for hours because my battery is telling me I only have 5% left, so this is good to sort of end it here. But oh God, I don't know. It's there's so much misinformation on the internet. I would say be careful what you read. I would say listen to testimonials and anecdotes with a skeptical lens. I would say talk to your medical provider. Tell them what you're doing. Don't be afraid to have that conversation with them. If you talk to your doctor or whatever type of clinician you see about cannabis and your interest in it or your use of it, and they are discouraging or they don't have any answers for you or they make you feel like you shouldn't be using it without a solid, educated rationale, my advice would be to keep shopping for a different provider because, I think there's a lot of, this is, as we've discovered in this conversation, this is a very complex field, and a lot of medical providers may be intimidated to get into it, and they may just have some resistance at the onset. And this is something that is very safe, and to a large degree, especially if we're talking about hemp-derived CBD, it's pretty inexpensive. So for me, if you're trying to answer the question, should I try this? And the thing that you're considering is generally safe and inexpensive, then the answer is usually like, yeah, you should try it. Mm-hmm. And also, just be careful. When we're talking about THC, use low doses and start there and slowly build your way up. And be patient.
So if somebody wanted to know specifically for them, we talked about a couple hypothetical patients today, but somebody has some questions or they want to read your publications, where can they find out more?
Yeah, you could go to my website, centerformedicalcannabis.com. I've got a blog there with lots of articles. My research is there. You can schedule an appointment with me there if you want to see me in person or over the phone. I've got a podcast that you can get to from there. So yeah, pretty much my website, centerformedicalcannabis.com.
With the battery you've had left, would you just describe what a visit with you would look like?
It's kind of like a standard healthcare visit with your average medical provider. I want to understand your health history. I want to understand what your clinical objectives are. I want to know what medications you're taking. I want to know about your lifestyle. I want to know what you're eating. I want to know how you're sleeping. I want to know how much stress is in your life.
So this sounds like an average visit with a naturopathic doctor. Maybe not all medical providers.
I'm very quick. I don't do, we're going to rip through. If you come to me, we're going to rip through it. So even though I'm comprehensive, like I don't do the 90-minute deal or even the 60-minute deal. Sometimes I do the 60-minute deal, but I need all of this information so that I can understand who you are and basically mitigate risks. Drug interactions is an issue for sure, especially with CBD. Psychiatric disorders, especially like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, like your family history of psychiatric disorders is important. That's something that I need to know about. And then obviously I want to know what your values are and what your goals are. And that way I am better able to recommend a specific protocol, hopefully, that will achieve those objectives.
That sounds great. Jamie, thank you so much for your time and for educating me. I've learned a ton today, and I am grateful I can pass it on to patients and also pass on your information to patients to get them the help that they deserve. Thank you for the work that you're doing, for the publishing that you're doing, for the contribution to the community, and also for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was my pleasure, and I was happy to be here, and it's always good to talk to you.
Talk to you later.
All right, bye.
Thank you for listening to Collective Insights. For the full show notes on this episode and for more great interviews, visit us at neurohacker.com/collective insights. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. Want to learn a better strategy for mental well-being? We designed a beautifully illustrated 32-page guide integrating care for your mind, brain, body, and environment into a balanced approach for a better life. Download the foundational guide to neurohacking at neurohacker.com/guide.